Made it to episode 2. Nobody told me that I can't do another one of these, so all right. We're going to go with the name Fresh Tracks Weekly. So that's what we're rolling with, and yeah, here we are. Since last week, the crew's been up to a little bit. Randy went to the Washington Sportsman Show. He did a little Q&A session there. The rest of us were back in town. Michael and myself went out, did a little exercise, a little downhill skiing. Unfortunately, some of our crew's out of the office sick. Luckily, not severely, so that's good. For those of us that did stay in the office this week, Michael cooked up some elk chili, which was pretty phenomenal. I think he's working on his secret family recipe, which doesn't exist yet, so it's a work in progress. We're starting this new thing where someone from the office cooks up lunch, a wild game meal for everyone else, the whole crew, so that's pretty fun. We're gonna make a little segment called Fresh Snacks. I'm a big fan of these weekly crew lunches. As hunting season progresses in the spring, this segment's gonna get a lot more exciting. We got black bear hunting in the works, turkey hunting, fishing. As soon as the ice thaws, we'll be out on the not hard water. Everyone else in the office has been super busy producing videos, editing. So on YouTube this week, you can check out our Montana deer camp. It was just kind of a good old-fashioned wall tent camp. It was a good time. Next week on YouTube, we'll be putting out an Arizona archery elk hunt. It was with myself and Kara. It was a sufferfest, so if you're into enjoying a good sufferfest, check that out on YouTube next week. As for the subscription platform, Fresh Tracks Plus, you can check out the mountain goat hunt that just dropped. It's a wild one. Definitely, if you're a subscriber, you'll want to check that out. And then next week, we'll be putting out some educational videos up there, everything from deer biology to some lessons learned that Randy filmed in Nevada, so good stuff there. On the Hunt Talk podcast, Randy talks with Lydia Parker and Alex Harvey from Hunters of Color. They talk about the history of the organization and how not everybody gets the same treatment in the outdoors. Definitely give that a listen. It's a pretty interesting conversation. So that's what we got going on in the office this week, and now we'll kick off some headlines. We're going to start with some feel-good news, because who doesn't love a good feel-good story? Kentucky has been restoring elk in the state for the last 25 years, mostly on the eastern edge of the state, and they're kind of working their way west. The Wildlife Department put together a really cool YouTube video. Check it out. It was this big collaborative effort between Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and the United States Forest Service to expand elk populations in McCreary County. They're going to translocate 30 to 50 elk, which is going to expand their current range further to the west. So yeah, good stuff. So the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation has committed over $1 million to wildfire restoration this year. Last year they had this huge project. It was 19 different projects over 8 states, I believe. Everything from planting seeds, sagebrush, new shrubs into these areas, all sorts of good stuff. Invasive weed control, stream restoration, water development maintenance. A lot of times when these fires come through, it takes out these old guzzlers or dirt tanks. So all of that needs to be fixed after wildfires come through. So Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation is putting a lot of money towards that. It'll be really cool to see what projects they work on this year. Another cool thing, hunters can now apply for an elk permit in Virginia. This is the first time where people have been able to hunt elk in 166 years in Virginia. So through the efforts of Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources and the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, elk have been reintroduced, and now they exceed a population that can sustain a hunting season. There's going to be 5 antlered bull elk tags awarded in a lottery, and that drawing is going to take on May 30th. Cool stuff. In Oregon, a new bill would provide $7 million out of the general fund towards wildlife corridor projects. A recent study conducted by State Farm found that Oregon drivers face a higher risk of wildlife vehicle collisions than their neighboring states of California and Washington. There's over 6,000 vehicle strikes with wildlife in Oregon last year. The state only currently has 5 wildlife crossing structures, which is kind of lagging behind their neighboring states as well. It appears a lot of conservation and wildlife groups are very supportive of this bill, and there's very little opposition so far from what I've heard. In Tennessee, 2 bills have been proposed that, if passed, would transfer possession of the Yanali, probably saying that wrong, Yanali WMA from the state of Tennessee to Maury County. Currently, the 12,800 acre WMA is open to public land hunting and various other recreational opportunities. This was brought to our attention by a concerned Tennessee citizen. The main concern that is if this land is transferred, it faces an unknown future for hunters and other recreational users. The county may have other motives for the land, such as the recent efforts to develop 500 acres within the WMA to build a new agri-center, as well as the county's search to find a new landfill site. So far, there's very little news coverage of this, so we're going to keep an eye on it as it develops. A concerned citizen in Kansas brought to our attention Senate Bill 395, which has been introduced, and if it passes, it would prohibit Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks from doing surveillance on private property without a warrant. Basically, if this bill is passed, if a game warden sees someone hunting on private land, they would no longer be able to check to see if they are following the state's hunting regulations. They would have to have probable cause in order to do anything. This is significant because Kansas is about 98% private land. On one side, you have the proponents of this saying that it would keep game wardens from violating the Fourth Amendment rights. They're arguing that game wardens are able to do too much without regards of private property laws. On the other side, the argument is that game wardens already have to follow all of the same constitutional laws as every other law enforcement agency, and this bill is an effort to privatize wildlife by not allowing game wardens to efficiently enforce laws in regards to publicly owned resources on private lands. As for things that we covered last week that have changed, the Colorado bill that we talked about that would prohibit mountain lion, lynx, bobcat hunting, that was rejected in committee, so that bill is now dead. Last week we also talked about the movement in Virginia that was to open up hunting on public lands on Sundays in the state. That I have not heard any new news on. However, I did see that South Carolina has very similar legislation that would allow Sunday hunting on wildlife management areas in South Carolina, which is currently prohibited. So multiple states are kind of having this movement of trying to open up Sunday hunting where it previously wasn't allowed. From what I understand, a lot of these states, it is allowed on private lands, but they are working on making public lands, wildlife management areas also open on Sundays. So the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Commission finalized the 2022-2023 hunting regulations last week. This season-setting process has attracted a lot of attention from various stakeholders as significant changes were proposed. The final commission meeting happened a week ago, which I sat through the entire 8-hour Zoom meeting. I'll try to boil it down to you to my basic understanding of what happened. The proposed hunting regulation changes did result in thousands of public comments, so it was pretty interesting to see how this all unfolded. While pretty much every species did face regulation changes, most of the attention was focused around the elk regulations. So they did go through everything else, but yeah, the afternoon session of the elk changes was probably the most contentious. But one interesting thing that did happen in the morning, one of the news proposals was to extend one hunting district season by 15 days to June 15th. Some districts already have June 15th closing dates, others close on May 31st, mostly for concern of harvest of sow black bears. During that meeting, Commissioner Pat Tabor made a motion to apply that June 15th closure date statewide, which would extend various hunting districts from that May 31st deadline to June 15th. This prompted a lot of comment from the regional managers, and which Commissioner Tabor listened to, and he withdrew that motion. But one thing that happened is that original proposal of the extension of the one hunting district still went through. Critics point out that the debate centered around the statewide season change, and when Tabor withdrew that statewide motion, the original season setting for that single unit was still passed. Critics also point out that Commissioner Tabor has an outfitting business that sells bear hunts in that mentioned district, which brings up whether or not there was a conflict of interest involved in that. But yeah, most everyone in the meeting was there to talk about elk. I'll back up a little bit and try to lay a little groundwork of kind of some key points for Montana elk hunting regulations. And this is going to be super oversimplified. If you're involved in this, if you're not, then it might be too complicated. I don't know. This is my interpretation of it though. So Montana has a lot of elk. We also have about 65% of the land in Montana is privately held, while about 35% is public. So a lot of the elk live on the private land. Hunter access on private land is very limited, so most of the hunting pressure occurs on public land. So this creates conflict. FWP, in theory, has to follow these objectives that were set by an elk management plan in 2005. These objectives are based largely on social tolerance of elk, mostly in the form of landowner conflicts, because elk will affect their bottom line, whether they're cattle grazing or ranching, farming, you name it. Elk can have an effect on their bottom line. It creates conflict. That's where we're at. So a lot of the ideas that were being pushed by the director of FWP, Hank Warsek, were in theory to reduce elk numbers in these areas that are over objective. So his first idea was to just give out more elk tags across the board, bull, cow, private land, public land, just more tags across the board. And to keep in mind, that's a very simplified explanation. It was a little more complicated than that. But this idea made the public land hunters very mad because it would very likely result in more crowded public land and likely push elk to private land. So several iterations later, back and forth with the public and the commission, the proposal was still giving out more elk tags in general, but with new limitations. So critics were stating that giving out more more tags doesn't necessarily equal more dead elk, which is the stated goal. But what instead the proposal suspiciously does offer is freeing up more bull elk tags to non-residents and helps outfitters get more tags for their clients. So where we're at now, after all the dust settled after this meeting, the regulations are now set for the 2022-2023 hunting seasons. So the commission amended these proposals to be significantly less drastic. They basically slowed down. They'd still made some changes for sure, but it appears that they listened to the concerns of the public land hunter, and they definitely slowed everything down. There's undoubtedly a lot of confusion during this meeting between the public and the commission and what amendments were being made. Everything was happening relatively fast when it all came down to it. But here's my oversimplified, again, version of what happened, and I'll try to explain it in the differences from this year going forward compared to last year. So if a hunter now draws a limited elk permit, they can now only hunt in that unit for that season. Previously, they could bounce around between that special draw tag that they had and the general units. More limited elk tags are available than last year, but it wasn't a crazy increase like initially proposed. There will be unlimited cow permits available in several regions. From what I can tell, they're not going to be valid on national forest lands, but they're going to be available on private, BLM, and state land, which in the units that they're talking about is mostly, the public land is BLM and state. There is some U.S. Fish Wildlife Service that will be excluded and some Forest Service, but that's kind of a contentious thing. We'll see how that all shakes out. It's hard to really grasp the whole what's going to happen there. A few units that previously had a harvest quota now have unlimited archery permits or included in the general season, but this is far less than what was in the initial proposal. Some hunting district boundary changes occurred that could potentially qualify new areas for liberalized elk harvest that were not previously qualified. We're not really sure how that's going to shake out yet, but it'll be interesting to see. Elk shoulder seasons, which were pitched years ago as an experiment, are now more set in stone into the regulations. And if you're not familiar with shoulder seasons, it's basically an extension on the regular season before and after. It kind of extends the elk season to be around 6 months of the year. So that's more set in stone now. It's going to be hard to tell what the impact of all of this will be, but realistically, the changes that were actually adopted it's not that drastically different from previous years, at least compared to the initial proposals put forward. From my opinion, from the perspective of a public land hunter, of how this is going to change the landscape next year, is some areas are going to have a little more hunter crowding than before, but some areas I think are going to actually have less hunter crowding. A few units that had small chunks of public land will now they're going to be ruined, honestly, because those general and unlimited tags, they're going to pressure the elk off those public chunks onto the private land. Those units are primarily big chunks of private land, but it's kind of a sacrifice, I guess. But yeah, the private landowners will now be able to get the tags that they want in those units. So for now, I would say you could mostly chalk it up as a win to the public land hunter. One of the big take-home messages for me is, for a long time, there's been this big push to give more bull elk permits to those with the deepest pockets. Basically, whether it's in the form of an outfitted hunter or non-resident landowners, it's this leaning towards privatization of wildlife, and that's what's getting these public land hunters most fired up and kind of trying to knock those proposals back down. So we're going to do a deeper dive into this. I already kind of started that deeper dive, but we're going to get Randy, and we're going to talk about the Public Trust Doctrine in his what he's coining the Bulls for Billionaires segment.
Of all the pieces you might ever have me jump in on, this is one I feel comfortable with because I've been a trustee for 30 years as a CPA, so I understand trusts really, really well. I don't understand wildlife science like you do, but this is one I might actually have some legitimate comments on.
Yeah. So, no, I'm excited to dive into that, but yeah, I think it's important to point out too, just with our show, we film on public land and hunt public wildlife, basically.
Right. Some states we're a resident, some states we're a non-resident.
Yep. But I grew up hunting wildlife out on public lands, and so it's like a hot topic for me. I get I get excited about it. Yep. I get kind of fired up, and
I think most everybody gets fired up on these topics. One, because of our passion for wild places and wild things, but also over time, we've all come to understand, even if we don't see how it is by definition, a resource held in trust for the public. And it's a state and provincial based system we operate in North America.
Yep.
And so the Public Trust Doctrine goes back to 1842. There was a case where somebody said, hey, the King of England gave me all these hunting and fishing rights here, mostly it was fishing rights. And the court said, no, when the king got kicked out, your right, gone. Now these assets are held in trust no matter where they exist, whether they exist on public land or private land. These wildlife assets are held in trust for the citizens of that state. So that's a really profound statement, and there's been case after case that has reaffirmed that. So here we are in 2022, and we're operating under a public trust doctrine for wildlife.
And you were explaining this to me before we started filming, and like break down the public trust doctrine. And because we're familiar with it, and we're kind of on Montana right now, we're familiar with Montana, you were going to use them as an example, right?
So we can use Montana as an example, but I'll use other states. I'll interject some other states to give maybe an understanding of why it is the way it is, or where it isn't what we sometimes think it is. So every trust is composed of three different things: a trustee, some assets the trustee has to manage, and beneficiaries that the trustee is accountable to, beholden to, for managing those assets. That's pretty simple. And most people probably think of a private trust. You know, how many times have you heard, I set up a trust for my grandkids? That's a private trust. A public trust is very similar. It's got the same components. And first thing someone says is, well, who's my trustee then? It's pretty much any elected or appointed official who has vested powers to enact or modify or adjust wildlife policy. So it might be your legislature, it might be your governor, it might be your commission. Most commissions are appointed. Now, again, because this is state-based, how we do it in Montana isn't necessarily how they do it in Vermont or how they do it in Florida. So when people think about how it applies in their state, they got to be understanding that this is state-based.
Right. But in some level, at the basic level, the state government in some form is responsible for allocating the wildlife resource to the beneficiaries, i.e. the residents of the state.
Exactly. And in Montana, like most states, we have actually enacted statutes to say, here's how our trustees must operate to make sure they're listening to the beneficiaries, i.e. the citizens of the state. So in Montana, we have public notices, we have to have public comment, and you got to give them this much time. If you change anything on the agenda, you got to reopen it back to public comment, So the state itself actually has built some structure of how the trustees are required to operate on behalf of the beneficiaries. And it gives us beneficiaries the right to engage in the policy and mechanisms to engage in the policy. So that's as simple as I can make it, because it really gets complicated when you dive into the details.
Right.
So how often do you say, well, that's not fair, I'm a non-resident, that's not fair? Hear it all the time.
Yeah, but like you were saying, it's to the residents of that state.
Right.
So it's up to the whole collective to decide exactly how a non-resident might
get to play into. I would really love to go whitetail hunting in Iowa or hunting deer, whatever, in Wyoming, or wherever else. But I'm not a resident citizen of those states, so I technically am not a beneficiary of the public trust that it holds in trust the deer resource in Iowa.
Right.
So any opportunity that I get to go to Iowa is merely because their trustees and their judgment or their operation for the state citizens said, by letting all these non-residents come here and pay so much money, it keeps all of our other beneficiaries at a much lower price. So we think that's good for the overall management of this trust. So I can get mad, scream, yell all I want, but I don't have any standing as an Iowa citizen. So I'm only they're along for whatever the beneficiaries and the trustees say I'm allowed to do.
Right. But even understanding that, but then each state, like how they allocate to their residents, this wildlife resource can be drastically different. And,
Huge.
But in theory, they all follow the same idea of the Public Trust Doctrine, that the wildlife are owned by the people, but
held
it can
in trust for the people. Yep.
Yeah. So, but they can be, the way that's allocated can be drastically different.
Way different.
I feel like it matters how much public land is in that state. Because, like in Texas, for instance, when it's majority privately held land, it's going to be very different how they manage their wildlife resources compared to a state where it's 50% public-private land. So I feel like the hotly debated or contentious states are like Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, New Mexico. I'm missing a few, Arizona. But Colorado, I mean, like, it's just like states where it's like a mixture across the landscape of private, public land. That seems to me, I guess, where it's a lot of the hotly debated topics like this. And like you were talking with, they have landowner vouchers in various states. New Mexico is like one of the big examples of how they have the transferable. And that's significant because the landowner can resell them. And so it's not like they just get a tag to hunt their own land. They can profit. And a lot of times a significant amount to allow someone else to hunt their land. But anyway.
So you take all of those, and if we go to the Montana example, so the campaign I called Bulls for Billionaires, right? That was driven by a lot of non-resident billionaire landowners.
Yeah.
They are not even a beneficiary under Montana's public trust. They're not even citizens of this state. So our trustees have no accountability to those people other than if they feel an arrangement with them can help the trust corpus and help all the beneficiaries.
Gotcha.
Because these trustees are held to some standards. They have to operate with full transparency. Without transparency, you don't have trust. And this is whether it's a financial trust or a private trust or whether it's a public trust. They have to operate for the equal benefit of all beneficiaries. There can be no conflict of interest and no self-dealing. So if you're a trustee and you're receiving campaign contributions from a non-beneficiary who doesn't live in this state, I think you better watch it. You as an elected official have this fiduciary duty to all of us beneficiaries. And because someone made a campaign contribution, you're going to go and benefit a non-beneficiary? Ooh, boy, I don't know that you want to go there. The other part is you have to be beholden to, as a trustee, you are beholden to the current beneficiaries and future beneficiaries. And that's why our model is always thinking about the next generation in the future, is because in a trust arrangement, you can't just say, I'm going to kill all the wildlife for the current people alive. You can't do that if there are what's called remainder or future beneficiaries.
Right.
You have to manage with them in mind also.
Yeah.
So it's actually a really good arrangement for sustainability if it's followed.
Yeah. We talked about how each state's going to allocate resources differently. Do we want to dive in a little bit on how, like some of the examples? We already brought up New Mexico. Like even in Montana, though, we do have landowner-sponsored deer tags already.
Right.
Elk tags got a lot more traction and a lot more people fired
So,
up. But there's Nevada has some landowner tags, but that one's interesting because
Colorado, all kinds of them.
yeah, but Nevada's mostly public land, and so it's like it operates at a way lower level. Colorado has them. But anyway, that's not the only way, I guess.
I'll go so far as to say, Montana, we've got some issues because we give away 15% of our limited entry tags to landowners. So our trustees, somewhere along the way, said it's worth taking 15% of the trust corpus in those units that are limited entry and giving those to certain people, whether they're residents, non-residents, as long as they're a landowner, meet this criteria, we're going to give those to them. Well, Mr. or Mrs. Trustee, what did you get out of it for those of us who are beneficiaries? Did you get us higher objectives? Nope. Did you get us access to adjacent or landlocked public ground? Nope.
Right.
What'd you get for us? So
Yeah.
when you start getting into allocating resources that are held in trust for the public, you as a trustee better damn well get something for it.
Yeah.
And then I could go to Nevada and someone would say, oh, they're transferable. Okay, if I'm a trustee in Nevada, I'd say, well, look, we started out our state wildlife plan for elk, it was capped out at 3,000 elk. That's what everyone agreed to. Well, through this program, by giving away 1.5% of the corpus to these landowners who now they got to provide public access, they got to allow you through their ranch to get to landlocked public lands. Now they agreed that we could have 15,000 elk in Nevada. So by just giving away 1.5%, all of a sudden you get a 500% increase in opportunity for all the beneficiaries. So I'm not saying one's right, one's wrong.
Right.
I'm saying it's a reflection of what that state wanted to do. And the trustee has the latitude to say, so long as I am managing this trust in a way that benefits all the beneficiaries today and in the future, I can say I've fulfilled my fiduciary duty as a trustee.
Gotcha. And so, yeah, it's interesting because I'm just thinking Montana-centric because I'm close to it and I see it, like how we got to this current regulation setting season that kind of like got us on this topic talking about it. Like, we want to like lay the baseline of how we got there. And like, I think one of the big things is that a lot of these wealthy landowners, like the out-of-state billionaires or whatever, but not just them, but they hold a ton of the elk on their private property.
The wildlife, wherever it exists, whether it goes from public to private to public, or if it stays on private, when you buy that land in Montana, you buy it with wildlife as a condition of the land, and you buy it knowing you don't own those elk.
Right.
But a lot of people move here and think, those are my elk. In some practicality, it feels that way because you control access to the deeded land. But that doesn't mean the state has to bend over backwards to manage elk according to your desires. Because they're the public's elk. So what benefits the public?
Yeah. But I guess to boil it down in like a very simple terms, this is my perspective, and it's going to like boil it down probably too simple. But it almost seems like the logic goes, if we reward these landowners with bull elk tags every year, that out of the goodness of their heart, they will allow more public access, which will allow us to reduce, like, because one of the big goals is to reduce elk numbers.
Right. They
They want to reduce elk. These units are over objective. They want to reduce elk numbers, and so you reward these landowners, and then they will allow access to reduce elk on their property in the whole unit, or the unit as a whole, I guess. That's like a super simplified version of it, but to me it doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem logical.
It's not going to work that way.
Yeah, I just don't fully understand it, I guess. But that's like I feel like that's what is the story that's being told to me.
Right. Montana hunters came out and forced the last 3 months. And our appointed trustees, who are commissioners, told our department, whoa, wait a second. We're as much a trustee as you are. You brought these proposals forward. We don't like it.
Yeah.
So they rejected a lot of it. So it's the stated goal. Now, so then this gets to, is the trustee required to give everyone access to those elk? Maybe not. But they certainly aren't required to give one group of beneficiaries access over another.
Right.
Or they certainly aren't required to give access to some non-beneficiary people, these wealthy non-residents, and get nothing for the beneficiaries.
Yeah.
It's okay if you do something with a non-beneficiary, but make sure you get something for the beneficiaries in return. This was kind of like, all for us and nothing for you.
Yeah. And I guess we probably should, like, I don't want to just like think that we're bashing on private landowners, because there are a lot of really good stewards of the land that have provided great habitat for the public's wildlife. And so but it just I get nervous when you start to reward, like, again, boiling it down in simple terms, we start to reward the wealthy, or anyone who has deep pockets is going to get more access than those who don't.
Right.
When it's a public resource.
Right. And as trustee, you have to weigh that. Am I getting something for the public for whatever I do over here? So we have block management where the trustees, our wildlife appointed and elected officials, said, we're going to take money that we collected mostly from non-residents, not all, and we're going to go pay some landowners.
Yep.
Well, if they just paid landowners and we got nothing in return, we'd be up in arms.
But in return, we get access.
Return, we get access to the public's wildlife.
Yep.
So the trustees can rest comfortable saying, hey, you know what? Just about every beneficiary tells us we entered into a good deal here. What you're talking about is, let's take a public asset again, instead of money, like license fees, tags. And if we give those to this group over here, we better make sure we're getting something for it. And maybe it can't be done in an arrangement that gets the public anything. And if that's the case, we shouldn't do it. Because as trustees, we're not following our fiduciary duty. Trustees have to operate within the context of where they are and what landscape, what state. So in Montana, we're 2/3 private, 1/3 public. Without giving deference in cases to private landowners with game damage, with being accountable for special seasons, with whatever.
Right.
You could lower their tolerance for wildlife in your policies you adopt, and that would be to the detriment of the trust and its beneficiaries. So in a state with a lot of private land like Montana, you have to balance that.
Yeah.
And make sure that these really good private land stewards don't get mad and say, heck with this, let's make this a wildlife wasteland, because that would be to the detriment of the trust and the beneficiaries. So it's every decision the trustee has to use these, transparency, accountability, no self-dealing, protect they got to weigh all that stuff with every management decision.
Yeah.
Where the friction comes is when we think that they aren't doing that.
Yeah. And another point I really like to make too is, as a United States resident, whatever state you live in, you don't get it, like you said, you don't get to just do whatever you want, but you do have input and you do have influence on what happens via the elected officials, and then us also talking with them and, lobbying them one way or the other for however you
Email,
feel
meetings,
fit
phone
is
calls,
what's best for the residents of your state. So
and this basic principle applies in every state. So if I go down to Florida and say, this is what I think, they're going to be like, get out of here. You're not even a resident. You aren't one of our beneficiaries. But all 50 states, all Canadian provinces operate on a very similar structure, where these trustees are beholden to the citizens of their state. And so far, it's worked pretty good. And as things change and the way our society changes, there's always going to be sorting out of what's working and what's not working.
Yeah.
That's why I think it's worth talking about these things on a show like this. So people understand if that's happening in your state and you feel like you're getting the wool pulled over your eyes, that's violating transparency. It's violating all these other trustee duties. Speak up, hold people accountable. Because think about if Montana citizens hadn't held our trustees accountable. We would have been stuck with a policy called Bulls for Billionaires.
Right.
Or at least called that by Randy Newberg. And a large group of non-beneficiaries, non-resident billionaire landowners would have driven this huge trust asset, i.e. elk and elk hunting opportunity, for their benefit, all to the detriment of the beneficiaries. So these trusts aren't like solid walls. They're always in flux and moving based on what the state, of that state, their beneficiaries, their law, things change over time. And trusts do change over time in trying to stay accountable to the beneficiaries. So if the beneficiaries never show up, the trustees are like, well, I guess they think this is okay. Yeah, sure. Boom, they approve it.
Right.
And
No, it's an interesting topic. It's
Yeah.
we've gone down some rabbit holes, but it's
It
a lot of
is-
opportunity for future episodes to dive deeper into any aspects of this. But
when we get into public trust doctrine stuff, Marcus, that's where I'm like nerding out, man. I'm like, sign me up. Get someone else to do the other pieces.
I'm
But this
learning
stuff,
a lot. Yeah.
and nothing scares a trustee more than when a CPA or an attorney shows up, because we know trust concepts, we know trust law, and they're like, uh-oh. I've said many times, I think if you are appointed or elected as a trustee of a wildlife or a state wildlife system, you should have to go to at least a full day of training on the public trust doctrine. And how many hours do you suppose any of these trustees have had on trust issues?
Yeah.
Just what they've researched themselves.
Yeah.
So, thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for being here. It's a heavy topic, and I think the Wildlife Society and that technical review I referenced, maybe we'll put it in the link in the description, but right at the beginning of that, they open it up with a Theodore Roosevelt quote. So I think we should close this out with that quote and let that sink in. Defenders of the short-sighted men who in their greed and selfish will, if permitted, rob our country of half its charm by the reckless extermination of all useful and beautiful wild things, sometimes seek to champion them by saying that the game belongs to the people. So it does, and not merely to the people now alive, but to the unborn people. The greatest good for the greatest number applies to the number within the womb of time, compared to which those now alive form but an insignificant fraction. Our duty to the whole, including the unborn generations, bids us to restrain an unprincipled present-day minority from wasting the heritage of those unborn generations. The movement for the conservation of wildlife and the larger movement for the conservation of all our natural resources are essentially democratic in spirit, purpose, and method.